Don't be difficult, Mom. The doctor agrees this is for the best. My son, Mark, stood at the foot of the bed. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He looked at the beige wall instead, at a water stain shaped like a sad cloud. The room smelled of bleach and something vaguely sour. The air conditioner hummed, a low, constant noise that did nothing to drown out the pounding in my ears. I pulled the thin, scratchy blanket up to my chin. My own son, talking to me like I was a broken appliance. A hot spike of anger shot through my chest, so sharp it almost took my breath away. Then, just as quickly, a cold wave of fear washed over me. This wasn't about the fall I took in my garden. This was about my life, my home, my independence. And I could feel it all slipping through my fingers like sand. A young woman in blue scrubs came in the next morning. "Time to get you into a fresh gown, sweetie," she said, in that high, chirpy voice people use for toddlers. She was gentle enough, but her words made my skin crawl. I wasn't her sweetie. I was Eleanor Vance. I had raised 2 children, managed a household for 40 years, and paid my property taxes on time, every time. After she left, I stared at the blank television screen across the room. A woman stared back at me. Her hair was flat and grey, her face pale. She looked small and lost in the oversized gown, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked terrified. It took me a moment to realize it was my own reflection. I glanced over at the small bedside table. They hadn't even brought my reading glasses. My favorite blue cardigan, the one I always wore in the evenings, was missing too. My daughter, Susan, visited that afternoon. She breezed in, her cell phone pressed to her ear. "No, no, the quartz countertops," she said loudly into the phone. "The grey veining has to be subtle," I told him. She wrinkled her nose as she sat down in the vinyl chair by my bed. "Gosh, Mum, what is that smell?" she asked, not to me, but to the room. She kept talking on her phone, telling someone named Brenda about the new backsplash she wanted for her kitchen. I just sat there, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, feeling like a piece of furniture. Finally, she hung up. "Oh," she said, looking at me as if just noticing I was there. "Mark called. He said we should probably move your things into a storage unit for now, just to protect them, you know?" The days at Maple Creek blurred into one long, grey afternoon. The food was always lukewarm and tasted of nothing. My roommate, a tiny woman named Doris, cried softly into her pillow all through the night. The call bells from other rooms rang constantly, a shrill chorus of need that the staff mostly ignored. My one bright spot was physical therapy. A young therapist named Chloe would come get me twice a day. "All right, Eleanor, let's see what you've got today," she'd say, her voice normal and respectful. She didn't treat me like I was invisible. I poured all my energy into those sessions, into bending my knee and taking a few shaky steps with the walker. It was my only job now, my only way out. I tried calling Mark, then Susan, just to hear a familiar voice. For 3 days straight, my calls went right to voicemail. I was sitting in a vinyl armchair near the nurse's station, pretending to watch the game show on the buzzing television. 2 aides were folding linens nearby, their voices low and gossipy. "The sun was a piece of work," one of them said, snapping a sheet flat. "Kept asking about the policies. You know, on residents' assets." The other one nodded. "Yeah, wanted to know what happens if the money runs out. He was real demanding about it." They moved on, talking about their lunch break, but their words hung in the air. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the draft from the window. This wasn't about my safety. This was about my house. It was about my money. And my own children had put me here to get control of it all. My daughter, Susan, finally visited a week later. She swept into the room, bringing a gust of cold air and the sharp scent of her expensive perfume. She tossed a small stack of mail onto my bedside table. Most of it was junk, catalogues and flyers, but one envelope had the county seal on it, my property tax bill. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the familiar address. My home. "Oh, that came," Susan said, not looking at me. She was busy wiping down the windowsill with a tissue from her purse. "I saw the yardman quit. The lawn is a mess. That house is just so much work for one person." "It was never too much for me," I said quietly. She just sighed, a puff of annoyance. I reached into my handbag on the table, looking for a pen. My fingers fumbled around inside. Keys, a little packet of tissues, my lipstick. But the familiar, long shape of my checkbook was gone. The next morning, when Susan stopped by for what she called her 5-minute check-in, I asked her, "Honey, have you seen my checkbook? It's not in my purse." She looked at the ceiling, tapping a finger on her chin. "Your checkbook?" "Oh, I think I took that home with me. Just to keep it somewhere safe. You don't need it here." "I'd like it back, please," I said, keeping my voice even. "Don't be silly, Mum. What are you going to buy?" she said, with a little laugh. The sound was like glass breaking. I felt a cold wave wash over me. I was a prisoner. They had my house, my mail, my money. The injustice of it all started to burn in my chest, a hot, steady flame. That afternoon, when the nurse brought my 2 o'clock pain pill, I palmed it. I slipped the small white tablet into the pocket of my robe. I needed a clear head for what was coming next. It took 2 days of hiding pills before I felt strong enough. I shuffled down the hall in my worn slippers, the rubber soles sticking to the linoleum. The communal phone was on a small table next to the nurse's station, its beige plastic receiver greasy to the touch. I dialed the number from memory. Betty answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, I was just thinking about you," she said, her voice a warm blanket. "Oh, Betty, I'm doing just fine," I lied, my voice sounding thin. "They're taking wonderful care of me here." I watched a nurse walk by, her shoes squeaking. I was just wondering, could you do me a small favor? "Anything, dear." "Could you just drive by the old house sometime? I worry about the rose bushes." Betty was quiet for a second. She knew me. She knew I never worried about roses when something bigger was wrong. "Of course, Eleanor," she finally said. "I'll go check on your roses today." Mark was the next one to visit. He came in carrying a sleek leather briefcase, smelling of coffee and importance. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He just pulled a sheaf of papers out and placed them on my tray table. The papers were crisp and smelled like a copy machine. "Mum, I just need you to sign a few things," he said, clicking a pen. "It's just some Medicare stuff. Helps us manage your care better." My hands were trembling a little, but I picked up the top page. My reading glasses were still at home, tucked in my nightstand drawer, but I could make out the big words at the top of the document. Power of attorney. I put the papers down. "No," I said. Mark's smile vanished. "What do you mean, no?" "I'm not signing that." His face tightened. "Mom, don't be paranoid. We're trying to help you." His voice got louder. "Why are you being so childish about this?" The humiliation came to a head that Saturday. A family was having a birthday party for their grandmother in the common room. There were bright balloons tied to the chairs and a big cake with pink frosting on a table. I watched them from my corner, a ghost in a worn armchair. The family sang "Happy Birthday," their voices cheerful and loud. The birthday woman, who looked even more lost than I felt, just stared at the cake. No one looked at me. I was invisible. part of the beige furniture. I wasn't just grieving for my house or my checkbook. I was grieving for a life I was still living. The smell of sugary frosting and cheap coffee filled the air. Right then, listening to the happy sounds of a family that wasn't mine, I made a silent vow. This was not going to be the last chapter of my story. During my next therapy session, I asked Chloe if I could borrow her tablet for a few minutes. The physical work was hard, and my muscles ached with a good kind of pain. I just want to look at some garden photos, I said, breathing a little heavy from the leg lifts. It helps me remember what I'm working towards. Chloe smiled and handed it over. Of course, Eleanor. Take a 5-minute break. The screen was cool and smooth under my fingertips. I didn't type in roses or hydrangeas. I typed in the name of my town, followed by luxury retirement communities. The pictures that came up made me catch my breath. There were sparkling blue pools, dining rooms with white tablecloths, and balconies overlooking the ocean. It was another world. Then, my fingers shaking just a little, I looked up the estimated value of my own house. The number that appeared on the screen was much, much higher than I had ever imagined. It was high enough to buy a piece of that other world. A few days later, I used the payphone in the hallway to call my old friend Betty. The receiver was sticky, and the cord was tangled. I kept my voice light, talking about the food and the physical therapy. "And how's the house, Betty?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Is the lawn looking okay?" There was a pause. "Well, Eleanor," she said slowly, "it's funny you should ask. I drove by yesterday. There was a landscaping truck there, but it wasn't your usual service. A big, fancy new one." I held my breath. "Oh?" "And Susan's car was in the driveway," Betty continued. "She was with a man in a suit. He was walking around the yard, pointing at the roof and the windows. Looked like a real estate agent to me." The cold dread I'd been feeling for weeks finally hardened into something else. It was no longer fear. It was a plan, solid and clear as glass. The next day, when Chloe came to my room for our session, I asked her to shut the door. The latch clicked quietly. The air conditioner hummed. "I need some different exercises today, dear," I said, my voice low. "Some privacy exercises?" She looked confused. "What do you mean, Eleanor?" I looked her right in the eye. I had seen the kindness in them, the genuine respect. I decided to take a chance. They thought they were writing my final chapter. They forgot I was still holding the pen. I took a deep breath. "Chloe, do you know a good lawyer? Someone who specializes in elder care?" Her eyes went wide. She glanced toward the door, her shoulders tensing. For a moment, I thought she would say no, that I had put her in an impossible position. But then she nodded, a quick, sharp movement. She pulled a pen from her pocket, tore a tiny corner from a therapy worksheet, and scribbled a name and a number. She folded it into a tiny square and pressed it into my palm, her fingers warm against mine. That night, long after the last meds cart had rattled down the hall, I slipped out of my room. The hallway was lit by dim safety lights, casting long shadows on the polished floor. I made my way to the communal phone, my heart thumping against my ribs. I dialed the number from the tiny piece of paper, shielding the keypad with my hand. A man's voice, calm and professional, answered on the second ring. "Davies Law." "My name is Eleanor Vance," I whispered, my mouth dry. "I'm a resident at Maple Creek. I need help." I told him everything, the words spilling out in a quiet rush. I told him about the fall, my children's sudden concern, the power of attorney papers, and the real estate agent at my house. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, the silence on his end of the line a comfort. I understand, he said when I finished. We can't meet formally, but I have an uncle who lives near your facility. I could drop by for a visit with my Aunt Eleanor tomorrow afternoon. The plan was moving forward. When Susan visited the next day, I put on my best frail and confused face. She was complaining about the price of organic kale at the grocery store. Susan, dear, I interrupted. The people here need some paperwork from me, something about my benefits. I need my original birth certificate and my social security card. She stopped scrolling on her phone. Oh, okay, Mum. I think I know where that box is. I'll bring them next time. 2 days later, she showed up with a bag of cheap lemon cookies and nothing else. Did you find my documents? I asked, keeping my voice steady. She wouldn't meet my eyes. You know, I looked everywhere, Mum. I just couldn't find that box. It must be packed away somewhere deep in the attic. I just nodded and took a cookie. It tasted like dust and chemicals. But I knew she was lying. And in that moment, I knew they had no intention of ever letting me be in control of my own life again. Mr. Davies arrived the next Tuesday, dressed in jeans and a faded baseball cap. He looked like someone's grandson coming for a visit, not a lawyer. We met in the common room, where the television was blaring a game show. The air smelled of floor wax and overcooked broccoli. He bought us 2 cups of weak coffee from the machine, and we sat in 2 sticky vinyl chairs in the corner. He leaned in close so I could hear him over a woman shouting answers at the TV. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice calm and low. Let's be very clear. As long as a doctor says you are of sound mind, you and you alone control your money, your property, and your decisions. He looked me right in the eye. I felt a lifetime of being a wife and a mother, of putting everyone else first, just fall away. My children thought my life was over. I was just learning that my signature was still worth more than their opinions. He handed me a piece of paper, folded into a tiny square. This is a list of documents we'll need to get started. Your original birth certificate, social security card, and recent bank statements. My heart sank. Susan had all of that, locked away in my old filing cabinet. Getting it from her would be like trying to get a bone from a dog. The next time Mark visited, I decided to test the waters. I put on my most confused expression, the one they had come to expect. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed over our heads. Mark, dear, I said, patting his arm. I was trying to remember my online password for the bank. My mind is such a sieve these days. He gave me that patient, patronizing smile. Don't you worry about that, Mom. I'm handling all the bills. Oh, I know, dear. You're such a help, I said, making my voice a little shaky. But I just wanted to look, to see the numbers. Could you help me reset it? Just so I can feel a little useful. He sighed, a big put-upon sound. He pulled out his phone, tapped on it for a few minutes, and then took a pen from his pocket. He scribbled a new password on a napkin from the cafeteria. Here you go, he said, pressing it into my hand. Try not to lose it. He was so smug, so sure of himself. He had no idea he hadn't just humoured me. He had handed me the key to my own cage. That night, after the lights were dimmed, I waited until my roommate's snores were deep and steady. I'd asked Chloe earlier if I could borrow her tablet to look at some gardening websites. Now, I pulled it from under my mattress. The bright screen lit up my little corner of the room. I typed in my bank's website, my fingers clumsy on the glass. I entered my information and the new password from the napkin. And then, I was in. It was all there. My social security deposits, my late husband's pension. The numbers were solid and comforting. I wasn't a charity case. I had resources. My resources. After checking everything, I took a deep breath and typed "sea breeze horizons" into the search bar. The pictures that loaded were of a different world: a sparkling blue pool, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows, a balcony with a pot of bright red geraniums overlooking the ocean. I stared at the images until my eyes burned, memorizing the phone number at the bottom of the page. The next morning, I bypassed my children completely. I walked with my walker down the hall to the social worker's office. It was a tiny, cluttered room that smelled of stale coffee and paper. Ms. Jenkins looked up from a mountain of files, her glasses perched on her nose. "Eleanor," she said, surprised. "What can I do for you today?" I didn't sit down. I stood as tall as I could, my hands resting on the handles of my walker. "I would like to file a formal request for a capacity assessment," I said. My voice didn't waver. Her pen stopped moving. "A capacity assessment? Is there a problem?" "No problem at all," I said, my voice even. "I simply believe I am fit for discharge, and I would like the official paperwork to reflect that." The look on her face told me this was not a request she got every day. She had to comply, but I could see the gears turning in her head, wondering who had put me up to this. A few days later, I found my chance. The main hallway was empty during the lunch hour. I walked over to the communal phone on the wall, the one that always smelled faintly of disinfectant. The heavy black receiver felt cold in my hand. My heart was thumping like a drum as I dialed the number I had memorized from the website. A warm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Seabreeze Horizons. This is Carol speaking." "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm calling about your one-bedroom apartments." "Of course, Eleanor," she said, her voice so kind and normal it almost made me cry. "Are you looking for yourself?" "Yes," I said, glancing down the empty hall. "My situation is a little complicated right now, but I am very interested." I gave her a short, honest version of my story. She listened without interruption. When I was done, she paused. "Eleanor," she said gently, "we do have a wait list for our ocean view units, but a one-bedroom just came open. I can't promise anything, but a spot might be available sooner than you think." The doctor who came for the assessment was a young man with tired eyes. He sat across from me in the small, stuffy visitors' lounge, a clipboard on his knee. The air hummed with the sound of a daytime game show coming from the television in the corner. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but professional. "Just a few routine questions today." I smoothed the worn blanket over my lap. "Of course, doctor. Whatever you need?" He asked me the date, the name of the president, and to count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered each question calmly. I told him what I'd had for breakfast, which was a lukewarm bowl of oatmeal that tasted like cardboard. Then he asked, "Do you understand your medical situation?" "I had a fall," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I broke my hip. I have worked very hard in physical therapy. Now I am strong enough to go home." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. I gave him a small, weary smile. "And I understand Medicare paperwork well enough to know it's more complicated than my hip ever was." He let out a short, surprised laugh. He looked down at his form, then back at me. After a long moment, he clicked his pen and signed the bottom of the page with a sharp, decisive scratch. He had no other choice. That afternoon, I found Chloe organizing her files. "Could I borrow your tablet again?" I asked quietly. "I want to look at some rose bushes for my garden." She smiled and handed it over without a word. "I didn't go to a gardening website." I went straight to my online banking page. The new password Mark had given me worked perfectly. My hands trembled a little as I transferred the deposit money to Seabreeze Horizons. It felt like I was cutting a rope. Later, I told Chloe I needed copies of my therapy exercises to practice on my own. She nodded, and when she handed me the stack of papers from the nurse's station printer, 3 other pages were hidden in the middle. They smelled faintly of warm toner. That night, in the dim light of my room, I spread the documents on my bed. It was the agreement for my new condo. I took the pen I had tucked into my sleeve and signed my name on the line. Eleanor Vance. It was the steadiest I had written my own name in months. My future was now printed on a piece of paper. When the social worker confirmed my discharge, she asked when my family would arrive. "They'll be here at 10, I said. Mark and Susan were right on time, their faces a mixture of relief and impatience. They thought they were taking me to Susan's spare bedroom. Susan fussed with my single bag. "We'll get your things from storage next week, Mum. Don't you worry." Mark just grunted and held the door. The air outside was cool and fresh, a welcome shock after weeks of stale, recycled air. I sat in the back of Mark's car, the leather seats cracked and familiar. As we pulled onto the main road, I leaned forward slightly. "You can just drop me at the house, Mark." Susan turned around. "Mum, the house is empty. We're going to my place." "I know," I said. "Thank you for the ride, but my real estate agent is meeting me there in an hour." The silence in the car was sudden and heavy. I watched Susan's face in the rearview mirror. Her mouth opened, then closed. Mark's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The look of pure, undiluted shock on their faces was the first real meal I'd had in 2 months. The house smelled of dust and disuse. Mrs. Gable, the agent, was already there, a sharp woman in a smart blue suit. She shook my hand firmly. "Eleanor, it's a pleasure. This house has wonderful bones." Mark and Susan stood frozen in the doorway as Mrs. Gable walked through the living room, talking about staging and curb appeal. "We can get this on the market by Friday," she said, her voice crisp and confident. "The demand in this neighborhood is very high." My children just stared, speechless. They looked like strangers in their own childhood home. Finally, Susan's composure broke. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at me, her voice trembling with accusation. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "This is our family home." I looked from her tear-streaked face to the empty space where my favorite armchair used to be. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the dusty air. "The same way you could put me in that home." Susan flinched as if I'd slapped her. I ignored them both and walked with Mrs. Gable, pointing out the few things I wanted. The grandfather clock, my reading chair, the small vanity from my bedroom. I had a pad of little yellow sticky notes, and I placed one on each item. It was a simple, quiet act of claiming what was mine. As Mrs. Gable went to measure the windows, Mark grabbed my arm. His grip wasn't hard, but it was insistent. He pulled me into the kitchen, his voice a low hiss. "You can't do this. You're not well. I'll get a lawyer. We'll contest your competency in court." I looked my son, Mark, right in the eye. The smell of dust and old memories filled the living room, but all I could feel was the cold, clean air of the future. "Go ahead," I said, my voice as steady as a church pew. "Mr. Davies, my lawyer, is expecting your call." He stared at me. The anger on his face flickered, like a candle in a draught. He was so used to me being a soft, quiet old woman. He didn't know what to do with this new version. He saw the legal papers Mrs. Gable had on the coffee table. He saw the clear, determined look in my eyes. "A lawyer?" He sputtered, his voice suddenly sounding small and childish. You got a lawyer? I did, I said. It was for the best. I used his own words against him, and they felt like stones in my mouth. I saw the fight drain right out of him. His shoulders slumped. For the first time in months, I wasn't the patient. I wasn't the problem. I was just his mother, and I was in control. The power in the room had shifted, and it was as quiet and final as a lock turning in a door. I checked into a nice extended stay hotel not far from my old neighborhood. The room was simple. A bed with a crisp, white comforter, a small kitchenette with a humming refrigerator, and a window that overlooked a parking lot. It was the most peaceful place I had ever been. My children did not find it peaceful. My phone buzzed constantly on the little nightstand. Angry texts from Mark. Long, rambling voicemails from Susan, full of tears and accusations. How could you do this to the family? One of them said. I listened to the first 10 seconds and then deleted it. I made myself a small bowl of oatmeal in the microwave. I sat in the clean, generic armchair and ate it slowly. There were no bells ringing. No one talking to me in a baby voice. No roommate crying on the other side of a thin curtain. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioner. I picked up my phone, looked at their names on the screen, and switched it to silent. The quiet was a blanket I could finally pull up to my chin. A few days later, my real estate agent called. I was sitting by the window, watching a woman struggle to load groceries into her car. Eleanor, Mrs. Gable said, her voice businesslike and sharp. I have good news. I held my breath. The coffee from the machine in the hotel lobby was still warm in my mug. Oh, I said, trying to sound calm. We have an all-cash offer, she said. 20,000 over your asking price. They're a young family and they want to close in 2 weeks. I looked out the window at the parking lot. $20,000. 2 weeks. The numbers felt like they belonged to someone else's life, from a movie on television. I thought of the beige walls at Maple Creek. I thought of my children's faces, so full of their own plans for my life. A strength I didn't know I had rose up in me. Accept it, I said, and my voice didn't even tremble. I called them. I knew I couldn't just disappear. That wasn't my way. I asked them to meet me at the little coffee shop on the corner of Main and 2nd Street. A neutral place, full of the noise of strangers and the smell of burnt coffee. I got there early and took a booth in the back, my back to the wall. They came in together, a united front. Mark's face was a thundercloud. Susan's eyes were red and puffy. They slid into the booth across from me without a word. The vinyl of the seat cushions sighed under their weight. Mark started right in. Mum, we have to talk about this. You can't just sell the house from under us. It's our home too. I picked up my cup of tea and held up my other hand, a gesture that stopped him cold. It's a little late for that conversation, I said calmly. I looked from his face to Susan's. The house is sold. Susan's mouth fell open. Mark just stared, his face completely blank. A waitress dropped a tray of dishes somewhere behind the counter, and the sudden crash was the only sound in the world. I let them sit with the news. The silence stretched out, thin and tight, like a rubber band. I took a slow sip of my tea. It was Earl Grey, and the scent of bergamot was a small, pleasant comfort. Finally, Susan found her voice. Sold? She whispered, as if the word itself was unbelievable. What do you mean? Sold? To who? That isn't your concern, I said. My voice was not mean, just factual. I reached into the old leather handbag that sat beside me on the seat, the one they couldn't be bothered to bring me at the nursing home. I pulled out two crisp white envelopes. I slid one across the sticky table to Mark and the other to Susan. Their names were written on the front in my best handwriting. Mark snatched his envelope like it might bite him. "What is this, Mum?" he snapped. "A check? A guilt trip?" I gave him a small, tired smile. It didn't quite reach my eyes. "Open it," I said. The house sale closed on a Tuesday. I was sitting in my little hotel room, watching the morning news, when my phone made a soft pinging sound. It was an alert from my bank. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the screen. The number was so large it didn't seem real at first. It was more than just money. It was security. It was a wall I could build around myself, one my children couldn't climb. I took a deep breath. The air in the room smelled faintly of coffee and bleach. I picked up the phone again, my fingers steady, and dialed the number I had memorized. A cheerful voice answered. "Seabreeze Horizons, this is Carol." "Carol?" I said, my own voice clear and strong. "This is Eleanor Vance. I'm ready." The silence on the other end was short, but I could feel her smile through the phone. She just said, "Welcome, Eleanor. We've been waiting for you." Before the movers came for my things, I asked Mrs. Gable for one last walkthrough of the house, alone. My footsteps echoed on the bare wood floors where rugs had been for 40 years. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The whole house smelled of fresh paint and emptiness. I walked into the kitchen. I could almost hear the ghost of my son Mark's laughter as he slid across the floor in his socks. I ran my hand along the wall in the hallway, where we had marked his and Susan's heights every year. The new paint had covered it all. I didn't feel sad. I felt like I was visiting a museum of a life that was over. I had loved that life, but it was time to leave the building. I walked to the front door, my handbag over my shoulder. I didn't look back. My revenge wasn't a loud, angry thing. It was the quiet sound of a door clicking shut behind me. The entrance to Seabreeze Horizons smelled like lilies and lemon polish. A young man in a crisp blue shirt took my suitcases from the taxi. "Welcome, Mrs. Vance," he said, and his smile was genuine. It wasn't the fake, pitying smile from Maple Creek. My condo was on the 3rd floor. It was smaller than my house, but the light was incredible. A wall of glass sliding doors led to a balcony. I walked right over to them and stepped outside. The air was soft and tasted of salt. Below me, a green lawn sloped down to a walking path, and beyond that was the ocean. It was a calm, endless sheet of blue, sparkling under the afternoon sun. I could hear the distant cry of a seagull. It was real. The picture from the brochure was my actual view. I gripped the cool metal railing of the balcony, and for the first time since my fall, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The next day, I decided to explore. The library was my first stop. It was panelled in dark wood and filled with comfortable armchairs. It smelled of old paper and leather. The indoor pool was in a big, bright room that smelled of clean chlorine, and the water was a beautiful turquoise. In the dining hall, a woman handed me a real menu with choices. As I was heading back to my condo, the door next to mine opened. A man with a neat white beard and kind eyes stepped out. He was holding a stack of books. "You must be Eleanor," he said. "I'm Arthur from 3B. Welcome to the neighborhood." "It's nice to meet you, Arthur," I said. "I used to teach history," he said with a little smile. "Now I just try to keep up with it. There's a social hour in the lounge on Fridays. Wine and cheese. You should come." He looked at me, and his eyes were full of intelligence, not pity. For the first time, I was being seen as a neighbor, not a patient. On my 3rd day, I went to the water aerobics class. The instructor played music from the 60s. I stood in the chest-deep water, which was as warm as a bath, and tried to follow along. I was clumsy, and I splashed the woman next to me, but we both just laughed. I laughed so hard I snorted, a real, undignified laugh that made my stomach ache in a good way. My body felt light and strong in the water. That night, I got into my own bed, with my own sheets that smelled of lavender. The room was completely silent. There were no bells ringing, no intercoms crackling, no one crying in the next bed. I pulled my soft blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes. I slept through the entire night. It was the most wonderful, liberating feeling in the world. I woke up to the sun, not a nurse, and I wondered what new thing I might try today. I had just come back from water aerobics, the faint scent of chlorine still on my skin, when the phone in my condo buzzed. It was the front desk. "Mrs. Peterson?" The young woman's voice was polite. "Your son, Mark, is here to see you in the lobby." A cold knot tightened in my stomach, unannounced. Just like he used to do at my old house, assuming my time was his. I took a deep breath, the air conditioning humming quietly around me. The old me would have panicked, would have rushed down, flustered. The new me took a moment. "Thank you, Maria," I said, my voice even. "Please ask him to take a seat in the lounge. I will be down shortly." I did not invite him up. I met him in the grand public lounge, with its plush armchairs and view of the putting green. He looked out of place in his wrinkled work shirt. He stood up when he saw me. "Mum," he started, a little too loud. "I was in the area. I wanted to see how you were settling in." "I am settling in just fine, Mark," I said, choosing a comfortable chair and leaving him to find his own. He tried to talk about the cost of the place, about my finances. I simply smiled and pointed out the window. "Look, the ladies' putting league is starting. That one in the pink visor, Margaret, she's a shark." He tried again, mentioning the house sale. I asked if he thought it was going to rain. He left after 10 minutes, a confused and frustrated look on his face. He had no power here. This wasn't his territory. It was mine. Back in my quiet condo, I saw the letter from Susan still sitting on my counter. I finally opened it. It was a long, rambling apology full of excuses. I read it once, folded it neatly, and put it in a drawer. I didn't feel anger or forgiveness. I just felt quiet. The next morning, I saw a notice for the community book club. They were meeting in the library to discuss a mystery novel I'd always meant to read. I put on a nice blouse and walked down. The library smelled of old paper and fresh coffee. About 10 women were there, and one man, my neighbour Arthur. The discussion was wonderful. People disagreed without being disagreeable. They laughed and made clever points. A woman with a bright pink visor, the one I'd pointed out to Mark, sat next to me. "You're new here, aren't you?" she said with a smile. "I'm Margaret." "Eleanor," I said, and I thought the ending of the book was a complete cop-out. Margaret laughed, a loud, happy sound. "Oh, I like you already," she said. "We've been saying that for years." For the first time, I felt like I was part of a conversation, not just a problem to be managed. I realized I felt more at home with these strangers than I had with my own children for a very long time. That feeling of belonging stayed with me. The next day, I went out and bought a few things to make my condo truly mine. I hung my favorite paintings. I arranged the family photos I'd chosen to keep on the bookshelf. I put my old, soft armchair right by the window that looked out at the sea. In the afternoon, I stopped by the little gift shop in the lobby. They had a display of orchids, beautiful and proud. I picked out a white one with a deep purple center. As I carried it back, Arthur saw me in the hallway. "An orchid," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "A woman of taste." "Or a woman who likes a challenge," I replied, smiling. That night, I sat in my armchair, the scent of my lavender tea mixing with the faint fragrance of the orchid. I looked around my little kingdom, a place I had chosen, a place I had paid for. It was safe. And I realized it wasn't enough to just enjoy it. I had to protect it. The following week, I had an appointment with Mr. Davies, my lawyer. I took a taxi to his quiet, professional office downtown. The air smelled of expensive leather and floor polish. He greeted me warmly. "Eleanor," he said, "you look wonderful. How is life at Seabreeze Horizons?" "It's everything I'd hoped for," I said. "Which is why I'm here. I need to update my will. And I want to set up a living trust." We spent an hour going over the details. He printed out the new documents. My hand was steady as I picked up the heavy black pen. I read each line carefully. My children, Mark and Susan, were still in the will, but they were no longer the primary beneficiaries of my estate. Mr. Davies paused. "Are you certain, Eleanor? This is a very significant change." I looked up from the paper, my signature waiting on the final page. "A person's legacy isn't what they leave to their family," I said. "It's what they leave inside their family." I signed my name, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room. A large portion of my assets would now go to a charity that provided legal aid to the elderly. My children would get a share, but they would never again get control. I finally sat down to reply to Susan's letter. I used the nice cream-coloured stationery I'd bought last week, the kind with a little embossed seashell in the corner. Her apology had been stiff, like something a child is forced to write. But it was a start. I thought about what I wanted to say for a long time, just listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator. I didn't write about the nursing home. I didn't write about the fear or the betrayal. I kept it short and simple. I told her I was glad to hear from her and that my new home was very comfortable. Then, at the bottom, I added the important part. "I would be happy to have lunch with you. The dining room here serves guests until 2 o'clock. Let me know which day next week works for you." I folded the letter, slid it into the envelope, and sealed it. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation to my world, on my terms. Susan chose Tuesday. She was 5 minutes early, standing awkwardly in the main lobby when I came down to meet her. She looked around at the plush chairs and the big floral arrangement on the center table. I could see her taking it all in. "Hello, Susan," I said. My voice was even. "Hi, Mom. This place is nice," she said. Her voice a little too high. We sat at a small table by a window. A waitress brought us menus and iced tea in tall, sweating glasses. Susan kept looking at the other residents, who were chatting and laughing. She saw Mrs. Gable, my real estate agent, having lunch with another woman and waving at me. She saw my new friend Margaret give me a little smile from across the room. After we ordered, Susan put her hands flat on the table. "Mom," she started, and her eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry. What we did, it was wrong. I was scared after your fall, and I let Mark convince me. I just listened. I took a sip of my tea. I was scared too," I said quietly. It was the first time I had admitted that to her. She looked down at her lap and cried, right there in the sunny dining room. I didn't reach across the table to comfort her. I just let her have her moment. The next morning, I decided my balcony needed some life. I took the community shuttle to the local garden centre. The air inside the greenhouse was warm and smelled of damp earth and fertilizer. It was a good smell, I bought 3 big terracotta pots, a bag of potting soil, and some small flowers. Back on my balcony, with the sea breeze gently blowing, I filled the pots with soil. The feeling of the dirt on my hands was solid and real. It felt like I was planting roots, my own roots, for the first time in a long time. Just as I was finishing, I heard a voice from the next balcony. "Starting a farm, Eleanor?" It was Arthur, the retired professor. He was holding a small green plant in a plastic cup. "Just a little something to brighten the place up," I said, smiling. "Well, every farm needs a tomato plant," he said. He leaned over the railing that separated our balconies. "This one's a spare. A sweet million cherry. They grow like weeds. You want it?" I took the little plant from him, its leaves soft against my fingers. A few days later, I was sitting in my favorite armchair, reading the weekly newsletter from the Seabreeze Horizons Homeowners Association. It was mostly boring stuff, a reminder about parking rules, the schedule for the pool. The paper felt crisp in my hands. I usually just glanced at it and put it in the recycling bin. But this time, a small notice at the bottom of the page caught my eye. It was printed in a little box. "The social committee is looking for a new volunteer member. Help plan our community events and welcome new residents. If interested, please contact the front desk." I thought about it for a minute. Me? On a committee? Before, I would have thought it was just more work. But now, it sounded different. It sounded like being a part of something. I folded the newsletter, but before I put it down, I picked up a pen from the side table and drew a neat circle around the notice. The phone rang on Friday afternoon. I was watering Arthur's tomato plant, which already looked a little bigger. I saw the caller ID was Mark's number. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but then I changed my mind. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. "Hello, Mark," I said. There was a pause. "Hi, Mum. How are you?" His voice was different. The usual impatience was gone. It was replaced by something else, something like caution. "I'm very well, thank you," I said. "I was just doing some gardening on my balcony." "Oh, that's nice," he said. We talked for a few minutes about the weather and a project he was working on. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in years. Then he got to the real reason for his call. "Mum, your birthday is next month. I was wondering, could my wife and I come visit? Maybe take you out for dinner?" The request hung in the air between us, a fragile bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. I was surprisingly good at planning a party. On the social committee, my ideas for the annual summer gala were a hit. I suggested a string quartet instead of a DJ, and real tablecloths instead of paper ones. My suggestions were not just heard, they were written down in the official minutes. I felt a hum of purpose, a feeling I'd thought was long gone. My phone rang one afternoon while I was looking at fabric swatches for the centerpieces. It was Mark. His voice was different, tense. "Hi, Mum. How are you feeling?" he asked. The question felt like a formality, like checking a box. "I'm very busy, Mark, but I'm well. What is it?" He cleared his throat. There was a long pause filled with static. "Well, things are a little tight right now. Jennifer and we had a disagreement. And I was thinking, just for a little while, maybe I could—" I waited, the swatch of blue silk cool against my fingers. I knew what was coming. "I need to borrow some money, Mum. Just a small loan to get me through a rough patch." The words hung in the air. A few months ago, they would have filled me with worry and guilt. Now they just made me tired. I thought of the beige room at Maple Creek. I thought of the power of attorney papers. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it felt as solid as stone. "What?" Mom, did you hear me? It's not a big deal, I'll pay you back. The answer is no, Mark. I have other plans for my money. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply hung up the phone and went back to my swatches. The blue one was perfect. I went shopping the next day for a dress for the gala. I hadn't bought a new dress for a special occasion in at least 10 years. I always told myself my old black one was perfectly fine. But it wasn't fine. It was the dress of a woman who didn't want to be seen. In a little boutique downtown, I found it. It was the color of the evening sky, a deep, shimmering blue. The fabric was soft and moved with me when I walked. I stood in front of the three-way mirror, the kind that shows you every angle, and I didn't flinch. I saw the woman Mark and Susan had tried to put away. But I also saw the woman who had said no to her son, the woman who was planning a party, the woman who was buying a beautiful dress just for herself. "It's stunning on you," the young salesgirl said. "Yes," I said, looking at my own reflection. "I believe it is." That night, putting on my makeup, I felt a flutter in my stomach. It wasn't fear, it was excitement. I hadn't felt that in so long, I had almost forgotten its name. The gala was more beautiful than I had imagined. The ballroom sparkled under the crystal chandeliers, and the string quartet played softly in the corner. The air smelled of gardenias and good food. I was standing with Arthur and Margaret by the tall windows, laughing at one of Arthur's terrible jokes, when I saw them. Mark and his wife, Jennifer, stood just inside the doorway. They looked lost. Mark wore a suit that was too tight in the shoulders, and Jennifer clutched her purse like a shield. They were scanning the crowd, and when Mark's eyes found me, his face was a mixture of desperation and shock. They made their way over. Arthur's smile tightened slightly. Margaret took a protective step closer to me. "Mum," Mark said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Jennifer just stared at my dress. "Hello, Mark. Jennifer," I said calmly. My voice didn't even tremble. "This is my friend, Margaret, and my neighbour, Arthur. We were just discussing the city's poor record on pothole repair." Arthur gave a polite, cool nod. "A fascinating topic." "Mum, please," Mark insisted, ignoring them. "About my call. I wasn't thinking straight." I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't my warden anymore. He was just a man who had made a series of bad choices and was now standing in a room where he didn't belong. The revenge wasn't in shouting. It was in the simple fact that my world was now full and bright, and he was on the outside of it. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, turning back to my friends. "Now, Arthur, you were saying the one on Elm Street could swallow a small car." He smiled, and we continued our conversation, leaving my son and his wife standing alone in the middle of the crowded room. Back in my condo, the silence was a comfort. The blue dress was hung carefully on my closet door, catching the moonlight from the balcony. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my favorite armchair. I didn't feel angry at Mark. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. That chapter was over. The story was mine now, and I got to decide who the characters were. My thoughts turned to Chloe, the young physical therapist who had been my first ally. She had treated me like a person when my own children had treated me like a piece of furniture. Her kindness had been the first crack of light in a very dark place. I pulled out my nice stationery, the cream-coloured paper with the little bluebird in the corner. I wrote her a long letter, telling her what her help had truly meant. I told her about Seabreeze Horizons, about the gala, about my new life. Then I took out my checkbook. I wrote a check for an amount that made my hand shake just a little. It was more than a gift. It was a statement. It was my money, my decision, rewarding the good in the world. As I sealed the envelope, a thought came to me, clear as a bell. There was one last document I needed to fix, one last chain to break. The next week, I sat across a polished mahogany desk from my lawyer, Mr. Davies. The air in his office smelled of old books and fresh coffee. He looked at me over his glasses. "So, Eleanor," he said, "a full update to the will and the trust. Are you certain?" "Completely," I said. The sun streamed through the window, warming my hands. I laid it all out. My condo and a small protected trust for Susan, to be managed by the bank. Another, identical trust for Mark. They would never have to worry, but they would never again have control. A few personal items were set aside for them, the things I knew they truly cherished from their childhood. "And the remainder?" Mr. Davies asked, pen poised over the paper. "The bulk of the estate," I said, my voice steady, "goes to the Coastal Seniors Advocacy Fund. I want it earmarked to provide legal aid for people in situations like the one I was in." He wrote it down without comment. He slid the papers across the desk for my signature. I picked up the heavy pen. I thought of Mark's face at the gala, lost and powerless. I thought of Susan's tearful, cautious apology. Maybe, in time, they would understand. Maybe not. It no longer mattered. "They'll have enough to be comfortable," I told Mr. Davies, signing my name with a firm, steady hand. "But not enough to ever be careless with another person's life again." I walked out of his office into the bright afternoon sun. I felt the sea breeze on my face. A car drove by, its radio playing a cheerful song. I felt light. I felt clean. I was, at long last, completely and utterly free. The night of the summer gala arrived, shimmering like a promise. The community ballroom was filled with soft lights and the sound of a live band playing songs from my youth. My new blue dress felt soft against my skin. I held a small glass of sparkling cider, the bubbles tickling my nose. Arthur, looking handsome in a sport coat, came over to my table. "Eleanor, may I have this dance?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "I haven't danced in years, Arthur," I said, but I was already smiling. "It's like riding a bicycle," he promised, taking my hand. He was right. We moved easily across the floor, and I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt since before my fall. Later, I sat with Margaret, and we laughed at the band's corny jokes. I caught my reflection in a dark window pane. I saw a woman with silver hair and a bright smile, surrounded by friends. She looked happy. She looked like me. Susan started visiting every other Tuesday like clockwork. She never came up to my condo. We always met for coffee in the public dining room, by the big windows overlooking the gardens. We talked about her work, my book club, and the tomatoes that were finally starting to ripen on my balcony. We never talked about Maple Creek. We never talked about the house. It was like a silent agreement. "That mystery novel you recommended," she said one afternoon, stirring her coffee. "I bought it. I couldn't put it down." "Did you guess the killer?" I asked. "Not until the very last page," she admitted with a small smile. It felt fragile, this new thing we were building. It wasn't the old relationship, heavy with obligation and resentment. It was something lighter, something built on choice. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I knew it was better. One evening, I was watching the local news, a soft Afghan over my lap. The hum of my small refrigerator was a comforting sound. A story came on about local businesses facing financial trouble. A picture of Maple Creek Care and Rehabilitation Center flashed on the screen. The reporter mentioned state funding cuts and mismanagement. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, not for myself, but for the woman who cried all night in the room next to mine. I thought about the money from the house sitting safe in my bank account. It was more than just security for me. It was power. The next morning, I used Chloe's tablet to look up the county's elder advocacy group. I made a large, anonymous donation online. My revenge was never about hurting my children. It was about making sure my story had a different ending. Now, maybe I could help someone else change theirs, too. The social committee gave me a new task: welcoming the woman who had just moved into the condo at the end of our hall. I put together a little basket with some muffins from the dining hall, a schedule of activities, and one of my small tomato plants. When I knocked on her door, a woman with frightened eyes opened it. I could see the boxes stacked behind her, the look of a life upended. I knew that look. I had worn it myself. "Hello," I said warmly. "I'm Eleanor from 3B. We're so glad you're here." It's it's all a little overwhelming," she whispered, clutching her robe. "I know," I said, and my voice was gentle. "The first day is the hardest. How about we start with a cup of tea?" I saw a tiny bit of the fear leave her eyes, replaced by a flicker of hope. It felt better than any victory I could have imagined. I was sitting on my balcony. My favorite wicker armchair was positioned just right to catch the last of the afternoon sun. A warm cup of herbal tea sat on the little table beside me. The salt from the ocean was a faint, clean smell in the air. My phone was inside, on the kitchen counter. I wasn't waiting for it to ring. I wasn't expecting a visitor. I was just there, watching the waves roll in, one after another, calm and steady. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and soft purple. I took a slow sip of my tea and felt completely, quietly, and powerfully at peace.